This story, believe it or not, will be true to me. This story begins around late April, early May of last year, and also in mid-August of last year. I live in northern Pennsylvania, and everywhere you look, there is nothing but woods that surround my town. I've lived in the woods my entire life, and I moved out into the town when I was 17. I'm 18 now, so it's been about a year since I stepped into the woods. As I said, this happens in late April, early May of this year, when the sighting happened. On one of my off days, I decided to go hike in my old woods. I didn't have a car, so I had to have one of my friends drive me out. Once I messaged him, we will call him R for sure, he came out and picked me up. I had my backpack full of water and snacks since I planned on being out there for a while. Once R dropped me off, it was around 3:30 p.m. I told him if I didn't message him around 6 or 7, they'd come looking for me. He agreed, and we went on our way. The path I took was a pleasant route, since it leads you to the start to a water reservoir that expands to the length of a few miles. The path itself was about 1.5 miles itself, but it was a pleasant walk, and I was happy to be back in such a familiar area. Due to the fact that I grew up living in the area my entire life, I knew almost every inch of the area and could tell that something was just by looking at it. Birds were chirping, there was a slight breeze, the sun was shining, and it was great. And that's when things were silent. I was about halfway down the trail when everything went silent at first. I thought it was odd, but I figured that I was walking the animals and they went quiet because I would freak them out maybe. But I also noticed that the wind stopped as well. Strange, I thought. The forecast said it was going to be a windy day, but I just chalked it up to the terrain. The way the path is that there is a hill covered in thick overgrowth and trees on the right side of the path, and on the left side of the path is almost a complete drop-off to the reservoir. So as I said, I just assumed that the wind stopped due to my location. That's when I saw it. I rounded a bend to see this massive buck in the middle of the path. It wasn't uncommon to see bucks in this area, but not of this size. Just by the look at this buck, I noticed that it was facing away from me, so I'm not sure how I managed to get this close to it. If, say, I was about a good 10 yards from it, I then noticed it was a 12-point. And my first thought was that he is lucky to have made it this far without someone snagging him. But then, things got weird. I noticed he had a long tail. I mean long. I'd say almost as long as a German Shepherd. Then, it turned its face towards me, and I swear to God this thing's face was just pure skull. There was no skin or fur on his face at all, just pure bone. Its eyes was blood red, almost as if someone poured red paint straight into the sockets. And that's when it smiled. Yes, smiled. It grinned from end to end, and I saw that I had massive teeth that looked like it could easily bring down a fully grown bear. Then, by the grace of God or by pure luck, it walked away. It walked up the hill, through the undergrowth, and I swear, I heard it laughing. It was near silent, but it sounded like a mix of a heavy wheeze and a soft laugh. I then took the opportunity to run back to where I entered. I ran so fast, I thought I was going to die from lack of oxygen. Once I got to where I started, I finally caught my breath. I then looked behind me, and I swear that thing was standing in the woods. I mean standing, like on 2 legs like a human. It then got back on all 4s, and with the same sinister smile, slowly walked back into the woods. I wanted to collapse, but I knew if I stayed any longer I would risk that thing coming after me. I started my journey home, since I had to walk back since R had to work on his dad's truck after he dropped me off. I then looked at my watch, and it was 5 o'clock. At least I got something out of it, but on my way home, all I could think of is what I saw. And only one word came to mind, and that word was Wendigo. Once I got home, I let R know that I was home. I then messaged my other friend, who we'll call Kay, about what happened. We are both big into stuff like the Wendigo and Skinwalker, so he believed me when I told him my story. He asked if I planned on going back, and I said not anytime soon, but when I do, I'm bringing one of my machetes. Fast forward to mid-August, and I finally decide to go back, but this time I had Kay, his cousin, who we will call Jay, with me as well. They had their own knives, since none of us were allowed to carry handguns. So, we got to the location and we started to hike. There was a slight frost on the ground, so we could hear anything that was coming, but we made an idea of going at night. But lucky for us, Kay had some extra flashlights in the truck. As we got closer to the spot, we kept hearing noises like footsteps coming from behind us. And when we turned to see what it was, nothing was there. Then once we looked behind us, a white owl flew past over the top of our heads and landed on the trees overhead. I knew there were owls in this area, but I always thought they were just brown and barn owls. If never in my life until that point, I never saw a white owl. We then decided to go back, since we took the owl as a sign to leave, and once we got closer to the truck, I decided to pull a risky maneuver. There was a small field to our left that people used to play in. They used to use it for their guns in hunting season. It was a typical field with high grass next to a tree line. I looked at Kay and Jay and told them my plan. They tried desperately to change my mind, but the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to do it. So I told the group to just keep an eye on my flashlight. If it stays normal, I'm fine. If it goes strobe mode, run for the truck. So I went into the field and I felt my friend's eyes watching me. It was going well until I heard a twig snap. I thought it was the guys following me, and as I turned to confront them, I wish I would have never kept walking there. There in the tree line, with those red eyes and evil smile. I couldn't believe what happened next. I swear I heard this they say in almost deep guttural voice. Please don't be afraid. I just want hell. I then walked as fast as I could, not to alarm the others. Looking back to make sure it wasn't following me, every time I looked back, it was still standing there, just silently laughing as it did before. I met up with my friends. They knew something was wrong, but told me my face was pale. My eyes were dilated so badly that they thought I was going to collapse. I told them we have to leave before it's too late. As we got into the truck and made one final look into the field and saw nothing. I still go up there time and time again to visit family, but I refuse to ever step foot in that part of the woods again.
Prior to moving to New Mexico, I'd never heard the term skinwalker before. I went to New Mexico for work and spent about 2 months there before relocating to Nebraska for a new assignment. I kept to myself for the most part and didn't spend a lot of time in the area. Every now and again, men I worked with would complain about noises that kept them up at night. I was someone who could care less about these spooky stories. All I cared about was sleeping at night. But the crew really loved creepy local stories and talked about what they would hear to pass the time. Initially, it was all fun and games, but eventually, they started talking about paranormal sightings, and having never experienced such things myself, I became intrigued. This went on for a time, and no one truly took it seriously until one of the men didn't show up to work one day. The guy that didn't show up was found huddled in his trailer muttering, "Hoofs, eyes, it laughed." That's how it goes anyways, as I wasn't there to witness. After being found, the rest of the crew was told they were going to take him to a hospital. I felt bad for the guy and assumed maybe the stress of the job had gotten to him. The other men, however, were beginning to get worked up. One night while at the bar, I heard 3 guys talking to the bartender about something possibly paranormal happening back at camp. The bartender appeared to be put off by the guys speaking on lore they knew nothing about, and would try to ignore the 3 and serve other customers as often as possible. Eventually, one of the men began speaking on skinwalkers, while the others listened really intently. The men were inebriated, which made them rather loud, and some of the customers began to look at them with disdain for how obnoxious they were being. I myself was thinking these men were making asses of themselves when I noticed an older man in farmer's attire with some Native American print on it. He was listening real closely to the conversation. The man looked disgruntled and quietly walked behind them, saying nothing. One of the men noticed this and asked the older man what he wanted. The man said nothing and continued staring at the group. Worried a fight might break out, I stood up from my table and observed what was happening. The men began taunting the old man, but still, he said nothing. Eventually, the three men got bored and the subject of skinwalkers came up again, at which now the old man spoke. "Stop talking about something you know nothing about." Hearing this, the three men now stood up, at which point I moved closer, hoping that the men would see me and realize they should stop. The old man stood his ground and told them not to speak on or meddle in things beyond their understanding. The men grew more irritated, and right as one of them started to step closer to the old man, I butted in. Being as I was somewhat of their superior on the job, the men finally left, leaving me and the old man behind shaking our heads. I apologized to the man, explaining they were drunk and didn't make it right, when the old man warned me to be careful. He mentioned the locals didn't talk about such subjects as it only brought unwanted attention. I didn't want to be rude, so I nodded and told the old man I'd watch after my team. I then returned to camp and found one of the men asleep in a chair, in his front of his trailer, a beer in hand. I didn't care if I left him out there, and so went inside of my own trailer and went straight to bed. It was about 3 in the morning when I was awoken to the sound of the men outside yelling. I got up half asleep to find men outside standing around something. I walked up to the overwhelming stench of a man, sleeping with his throat cut. Apparently he had taken his own life with a shard of beer glass. I stepped away, sick to my stomach, but the others stayed behind. I went off path, vomited, when I heard something behind me. When I looked, I couldn't quite make out what was there, only that it was standing a few feet away from me. Initially, I thought it was one of the men, but the person walked funny. I called out to the person, asking them to identify themselves. There was no answer. Instead, the person walked closer, jerking funnily as it did. It was almost like a child learning to walk. I called out again, and this time I got a response. The voice sent chills up my spine, sounding inhuman, but almost as though it was trying its best to hide that. The part that scared me the most was that his body began twitching. I began backing up slowly, trying to decide what to do next when it spoke again. Nothing it said made sense, and I couldn't understand it. Eventually, the thing walked into the moonlight, and I got to see the horror for myself. It was a mesh of Carl, the man who was dead in the chair, and something goat-like. His skin was stretched out, and his face looked like a mask. The feet? Well, they weren't feet, they were hooves. I turned and ran out there as quickly as I could, hoping the thing wasn't going to pursue me. Everyone else was so focused on the body they didn't even notice me running to my trailer. I quickly called the local sheriff, who informed me he was already on his way after the call about Carl being dead. I didn't leave my trailer till the sheriff arrived, as I was still unsure of what to say to him. Sometime after Carl's death, a lawsuit was filed against our company for not finishing the job we were contracted to do. That being said, no one would go out back to that area ever again after several sightings of something inhuman surfaced from the area. I was one of the first men who packed my things and left. I stopped by the local bar on the way home, hoping to find that old man from the other night. He was sitting in the same exact spot he had been that night, drinking. Before I could say anything, he spoke. I warned them. We can't go around talking about stuff like that and expect nothing to happen. I didn't respond to this, but instead asked what I wished to ask. Did he really take his own life, or was it a skinwalker? The old man looked at me and said in a very serious tone, "Don't talk about them. It will attract their attention." The man got up and left without another word. This was the last time I'd ever said that word out loud again.
My name is Nathaniel, but most of my family members called me Nate or Nathan. And by the time these events had happened, I had fully moved out of my aunt's acreage and had been living in my creepy house for about 5 years. I had turned 11, and I had come to visit my aunt and uncle for a family get-together to say hi and hang out with my cousins. I will give a little background information about the house. It was built by my aunt and uncle before I was born, and it lay on a hill with part of the basement not inside of the ground because the hill is sloped. The part of the house that is not in the dirt faces the woods and has 3 windows on the left side of the living room and a large door that is on the left of the room that is right next to the last window toward the left of the living room. There is a large door that is on the left of the room that is right next to the last window of the left of the living room. There is also an inlet area to the very far right that has a counter or bar-looking area. This is buried under the hill, so it doesn't have any windows. The living room is connected to the stairs that are in the hallway, and the hallway has a bathroom at the end of it. There are 2 spare rooms and a toy room on the right side. The toy room also leads into a room that connects to the outside through a little door and window. This room isn't usually locked, because the door that leads to the toy room is locked 100% of the time. This door that connects to the toy room is made of wood and has a pane of misted, translucent glass. We ate dinner, and my mom and aunt decided to get drunk, so we were going to have to stay the night. My brother and I had to sleep in the basement, and I was fine with it because I had stayed there many times before. My brother and I were forced to stay in the same room downstairs by the living room, which faced the woods directly across from the house. The windows facing the forest are split up, and there are 3 of them on the left side of the room. They are 5 feet by 3 feet windows and are very large. The room also has a door on the right side of the room, just next to the last window on the left. This door doesn't have a lock on it, it's just a doorknob. It's not like I haven't seen wolves, coyotes, bears, and mountain lions, and since I am an avid hunter, I'm quite sure the thing I saw that night was not any of them. During the night, around 3 in the morning, I had gotten up to get a drink, and while I was in the washroom, I heard a tapping sound from the living room, and then I heard my name called. "Nathaniel, come here." The voice called in my mom's voice, and I found this weird because she usually calls me Nathan. But she was intoxicated, so I didn't feel too concerned. Thinking she was drunk and was sleeping on the downstairs living room couch, I peered around the corner of the hallway to look into the living room. This, however, was a mistake, because what I saw was a large figure standing about 5 feet from the window. The only features it had that I could see were its arms, that were very long and had a full set of creepy, spindly fingers. Its torso was very thick at the top, but turned into a V shape as it went down towards the waist. I could not see the head, because it was so tall the head was out of view. As I watched it, it began to move towards the door that leads into the living room, and with a long, thin arm it reached for the handle. Seeing this happen seriously disturbed me, and I knew I needed to scream. So that is what I did. I screamed so loud that I woke up everyone in the house, including my very drunk aunt and mother. Before I knew what was happening, the thing at the door bolted into the woods, and these woods were about 50 feet from the door. And it made that run in about 1.5 seconds flat. As I watched it running before it went into the woods, it went down onto all 4s and disappeared into the pitch-black darkness of the forest. About 10 seconds after this, my uncle came down the stairs with his loaded shotgun that he kept in the house. He saw me on the floor just outside the living room, almost pissing myself. He knew I had seen something and asked what it was. I told him, but he just shrugged it off because he thought I had seen a wolf or coyote outside the door. The worst part was, when I went up to the door and looked at the knob, I realized it hadn't been locked. I'm 18 now, and I have not stayed at this house until recently, about 2 months ago. This time I stayed the night because my uncle and I were going out the next day on a week-long camping trip to go hunting and fishing. I again had to stay in that basement in the guest room next to the living room. I didn't really feel unsafe that night until I was awakened by a noise in the toy room across from my room. A tapping noise, and then a voice that sounded like my uncle's, but strangely weird. "Nathaniel, come here and give me a hand." By this time, I was seriously freaked out, and I looked outside my room into the toy room. Inside that room, I could see the door that connects to the next room, and through the glass, I could see the figure. The same figure I had seen so many years ago, standing there and tapping on the pane of the glass. I went up to the hallway connecting door and slammed it shut. and collapsed against it, beginning to cry. My aunt and uncle heard the door slam and ran downstairs to see me crying. They asked what happened, and they asked me a very creepy question. Did you see the thing? This thing that's been bothering us for years? I looked up at them, and I could see the fear in their eyes. I nodded, and they sat next to me and gave me a hug. The next morning, my uncle and I headed out, and we went on our trip. Before going, we looked in the room I saw the figure in that night, and on the other side of the pane of glass, there was a chip that wasn't there the day before. Apparently, after I had seen this thing 7 years earlier, it had begun to torment my cousins by tapping on their windows and calling in their mom and dad's voices, calling their names and asking to be let in. This thing, whatever it is, it still comes almost every month to ask my cousins to be let in using their parents' voices.
I live on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. My house is in Tennessee and our backyard is half fenced off and half wooded. It continues to a collapsed barbed wire fence that separates the states. I like to go exploring out there. During the summer, everything is in a shadow of green, and in the winter, the blanket of snow is just really peaceful. I assume the land belongs to a farmer because there are a crop field not far off. After you pass the collapsed fence, I keep going another 10 or 20 yards until I hit a small clearing in the trees. I don't go too far out, because I don't want to risk getting shot by some crazy redneck. As an added defense against possible hunters, I always go out in my bright red jacket. I like to go out and explore the terrain. There are many sinkholes and fallen trees to explore. Sometimes I find bones and feathers that I use in my art. One winter, I went out past a small clearing, something I'd never done before. I was unfamiliar in the territory. Thinking back, I don't know why I went further. Curiosity, maybe. But after I left the clearing and went into the thick woods again, I immediately felt uneasy. Brad chalked up to being in a new place and the higher risk of getting caught trespassing. I decided to put in an earbud to call my nurse. I had a playlist specifically made for wandering in the woods. After a few steps in, I noticed that the bright white snow was light gray now. The trees, even with no trees, were closer together than the ones near my house. So much so that they were making it darker than usual. And for some reason, I determined turning my volume up would make me feel better. The exploration song from the Caroline movie was playing. Sitting, I know. When the song ended, there was a second of silence before the next song started. In that second, I heard a distant scream. Thinking I'd been found by the owner of the property, I pulled my headphones out. I looked around to try and spot the source of the noise, but everything was quiet except for my slight buzz of the music from the earbuds. I began to back up and turn around to continue my exploration. When I was completely around, I heard the scream again. But it wasn't distant this time. It was loud. It sounded like a mixture of a man and a beast hollering in pain. Right behind my head. I wiped my body around and leaped back. There was no ground. I fell into some deep gully. I saw a dark blur as I fell and blacked out. When I awoke, I was being dragged across the snow. The back of my head felt warm and wet. Everything was moving in and out of focus. I moved my gaze toward my feet. Someone dressed in all black was pulling by my ankles. Something was off. It appeared to be wearing antlers, but they were unnaturally large. I let out a groan and the black fur turned its head to me. It was wearing a deer skull for a mask. My head hurt too much to understand what this person was doing. All I knew was that someone was dragging me somewhere and that I was hurt. I had to get away. That's when I started looking around and noticed something off about this person's knees. They were bent back like an animal's, not like a human's. Things were becoming more focused now, and I could make out vertebrae sticking out of its back. This thing was skinny, with its hip bones protruding out and small tufts of hair. I could tell it was tall, taller than 6 feet, maybe even 7 feet. When I regained all my senses, I only needed a second to make the connection. I had listened to plenty of stories online to know what this was. Now, I'm not a screamer. Anything that makes normal people scream makes me laugh, or I'm just quiet. But I screamed. I screamed like a freaking baby, like a banshee on crack, which I think surprised the beast because he dropped my leg and retreated, screaming itself. I never ran so fast in my life. The cold air was burning my lungs. I was looking at the sky. The sun was setting. I changed my course knowing if I ran south I'd eventually hit a road or houses something, or somewhere in the woods. I could hear it scream once more. It made me run faster. When I got out of the woods, I had ended up in a soccer field behind an elementary school down the road from my house. I collapsed on the ground trying to catch my breath. My heart stopped when I heard my phone ringing in my pocket. It was my mom calling to make sure I was okay. The dogs were barking like crazy because they heard the faint scream from the woods. My mom thought it might have been a wildcat. I broke down crying, telling her to please come get me. She tried to comfort me by saying that it was just some crazy redneck serial killer, but part of her knew what I saw wasn't a nut job asshole in the woods. I ended up getting 6 stitches in the back of my head from that fall. It's been 2 years since I've gone back to the woods, and we're finally moving away from that area.
When I was in high school, my friend and I saw something that I referred to as a crawler. The following story takes place in Rossville, Illinois, sometime around later summer or early fall, in a cemetery under the full moon, sometime between 2007 to 2010. My friend and I used to walk this loop, leaving her place and going down a block to a side road that led to the park. It was from there we would turn left and cut across the park until we reached the side entrance of the cemetery. The cemetery and park sat on the southwest corner of town. Beyond this were nothing but cornfields and woods. When we wished to leave, we'd take another side road that led to the main street and back to our house. Anyways, we made it to the cemetery that night and were walking the main drive that split the property in half, when suddenly, we both heard a noise that made us stop in our tracks. My friend nervously laughed and asked if I'd heard anything, at which point I informed her I'd seen what made the noise. To our left, I'd seen something run behind the headstones. It sat in all fours, but it was humanoid. This thing had extremely pale skin, no hair, and was extremely thin. I remember how it would reflect in the moonlight because of how pale the skin was. It moved faster than any human I've ever seen and was in a total profile, so I never saw its face or features. The way it ran was a lot like an animal that had gaits where its feet became forward, almost between or past its hands. If you like a better visual of what I mean, watch a video of how a big cat or a wild dog runs. Terrified, we called one of our friends out to meet us and take us the rest of the way back home. While we listened to the thing move, just outside of our sight, my friends was a typical high school boy and was to hang out around the cemetery and goof off upon his arrival. Admittedly, with him there goofing off, things seemed less scary, although I could hear the creature continuing to make wide circles around us, just out of sight. It would occasionally get closer, but then it'd simply dart away again. Eventually, we all left, and afterward I decided to do research into the thing. I spent a long time while researching it, and even reached out to a paranormal group based out of Champaign for advice. The guy I talked to never heard of it, and claimed he wanted to document what we saw. Sadly, however, we met up for an interview, but the group never did an investigation. Fast forward a few years, and I'm now living in Aurora, Colorado. This is where I met one of my closest friends in 2012. The both of us being into the paranormal made it easy to become fast friends. I eventually confided to him my story of what happened years ago, and his jaw hit the floor in shock. He'd said he'd seen the same thing and proceeded to tell me his story. He described what he saw, but said he'd seen it under a porch while living in Thornton. He said it was crouched and squatting, eating something, but he startled it. He comes from a Navajo Apache background, and when he first saw the thing, he thought maybe it could be a skinwalker or a wendigo. But upon further reflection, decided he had too many doubts about it being either of those creatures. At the time, my friend was dating a girl whose mother claimed to be a medium, and she said she believed someone had awoken something, but we both had serious doubts about that theory. The strangest thing happened when we both brought it up, though. We both had intense nightmares about it. His was worse than mine and lasted longer. This was followed by a 6-month span of anxiety and very bad luck for both of us. I always sort of brushed this off as psyching ourselves out. That's why I sent my story into your podcast. I couldn't just write this off, as our nightmares matched exactly. I'd never given out the details of my friends or I's nightmares. I've since dug through tons of lore and stories on the internet and elsewhere, and I'm still not sure. I don't know what this thing was. My best guess at this point is that the nightmares aren't coincidental, and that this being is something interdimensional. It seemed like it can interact with those on a physical plane of existence, but I've never heard of any stories where the thing touched or tried to attack anyone who has seen it. I speculated off and on what this thing could be. The only conclusion I come to is Skinwalker. It doesn't exactly fit that profile, though. I'm only left to believe that it's something that has been around and sightings of it inspired other cryptid paranormal tales. My boyfriend and I were driving home after a date about a year ago. I don't quite remember where we were, but we were driving along a one-lane back road. No street lights, but corn rows on left and tall grass on the right. It was late and completely dark aside from our headlights. My boyfriend was singing while driving, and I was in the passenger seat on my phone. Suddenly, my boyfriend stopped singing. I look at him. My eyes huge as he slams the brakes, and I try to brace myself with my hand, hurting my wrist in the process. My wrist is throbbing, but as I look up, my pain was replaced by fear. We weren't completely stopped, and we were slowly rolling down the road when we saw what looked like to be a coyote walk out into the road in front of us. The problem was, I studied wildlife at university, and something was very off about this coyote. It looked like a coyote, but it was very large and stiff. We initially thought it was scared or hurt, but looking more closely, I noticed its skin was tight, and it looked like though it couldn't move at all. It was like someone was wearing a coat that was too small for that. The legs were definitely not coyote-like, and they were lanky and almost seemed to glide with small shudders in each step. The thing crossed our truck, and it stopped and then turned its head to look at us. Its eyes were empty and human-like as it stared at us for what felt like hours, but clearly was only seconds. I continued on towards the cornfield and stopped at the edge, just before darting away in a flash. If I hadn't been there for what happened next, I wouldn't have thought anything of this encounter. The same spot the coyote walked into. A split second, a human walked out of it. I started screaming, and my boyfriend floored it. It wasn't until I finally calmed down that my boyfriend told me that it was probably a skinwalker.
Okay, so for privacy reasons, I will not be using my real name. In this story, my name is Cole. I was in middle school and 14 when this happened. In California, we tend to go out hunting, or if you can't, then you play hide and seek and other games like manhunt and stuff. My friends and I were playing hide and seek. Their names are Zach, Jordan, Amelia, and Joe. Zach was it. We all charged away from our houses and into the woods. Joe and I hid in trees and not far apart, maybe a few trees away. It was getting dark when we started, so it was probably 9:45. Also, the seeker had a flashlight. Joe and I were waiting to get caught and were whispering to each other when out of nowhere, heavy crunching of leaves came from the left. There was no light and we thought it might be Jordan, but we didn't call his name in case it was an animal. The crunching was about 20 feet away, then it stopped. I heard a very quiet scraping noise, then the scraping started again, even closer, like it had come 10 feet closer in 5 seconds without making any noise at all. Joe and I heard a tree branch snap and looked where it might have come from. This thing was in a tree in the middle between me and Joe. It was very long and had some hair on its arms and legs, and no hair anywhere else, and had sharp stubby-like claws for climbing. It had ripped up the branch it was on. This thing was looking at me now. I was scared out of my mind. It made a roar or a hiss, and in a fraction of a second, it was on the second tree closer to me. I jumped down and screamed with all my might. "Get away! Joe, run!" The creature was now in the tree that I was in merely seconds before. Joe heard me and jumped out of his tree, and we ran so fast that we were in my house in a snap. We heard loud ripping noises coming from the woods. We took my dad's flashlight that can light up a distance of 50 feet and shined it at the tree. The tree was torn apart. Then we heard insanely deafening steps. We shined it in the forest again, and it was making its way toward us. It was over 9 feet tall, with black eyes and huge hands. We flew inside, locked all the windows and doors, and called our parents and the police. Jordan, Amelia, and Zach ran inside when they heard us screaming. I don't know what I saw that cold day, and I'm glad I made it out alive at all.